What first tipped you off that your neighbor was weird Krasanaut, right? Story 1, when she called the cops for a noise complaint at about 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night. They showed up, knocked on the door, and looked around confused and half-embarrassed. Cops were here about a noise complaint. Were you, having a party before or something? That's where we're playing board games and have some music on. Cop's music. Cocks his head as if listening carefully. Okay, well, keeping it down, I guess. This became a semi-regular thing. And at some point, the cops stopped showing up. She then switched to calling our landlord anytime we were hanging out in our living room. Existing at normal volume levels after 8 p.m., landlord was like your neighbor. I think she's maybe crazy. Yes, she was. Edit also, this was separate houses, not an apartment. Story 2, when I was first moving into my house, a couple neighbors came over to introduce themselves. Regular old suburban dudes with their kids. Great guys. I asked about the neighborhood and like that. They both kind of glance across the street. You met Ed yet? No, we just got here. Yeah, nice guy. Divorced, travels a lot. His door is always open, though. I was like, AW, how nice. What a wonderful place to have bought my family's first home. Yep, not a euphemism. Ed leaves sometimes for a week at a time. Front door just blowing in the wind, widely open. When he is home, the door is also open. His car is parked half in the front yard, and he is rocking out to Bon Jovi and other 80s type stuff. Ed is probably living the dream on some level. Not a care in the world, but it is a little odd to behold. Story 3, he let me swim in his pool when I was a teenager, but would stare at me on his deck the whole time. 3 years later, he got caught with child all over his computer. Story 4, when his daughter was screaming on their front lawn that he was abusive, we called the cops. They continued to be a delight to live next to, until we thankfully moved a year later. Story 5, he kept 9 Rottweilers in his 1-bedroom, 3rd-floor flat. He took them for walks attached to a stolen supermarket trolley. Despite this, he never flooded the place or set fire to it, so still counts as one of our best neighbors. Story 6, sitting outside one day with my boyfriend, and my neighbor walks over with his bike and starts showing it off, pointing out the neon colors, talking about how fast he can ride it down the sidewalk, etc. He then proceeded to get on the bike and show us that he can do a wheelie. This neighbor is a 30-something-year-old grown man with no intellectual disabilities, just a lot of drug use. Story 7, I was out front working on something and had my schnauzer with me. He was on a long lead that was tied off and could not reach the sidewalk. The crazy old guy, a few houses down, decided to come over to introduce himself. At this point, we had lived here for over a year, and he never made any attempt to say hello. He would just glare at us whenever we passed his house. He showed up carrying a 4-long-1 rod and announced he brought it in case he needed to hit my dog. Story 8, a house I used to live at. A lady and her handicapped husband lived across from our driveway. They were about in their late 70s. In about 1994 or so, I bought my wife a new Mitsubishi Eclipse, and the lady came over and screamed at me for about 20 minutes for buying a Jap car. Then she really lost her when I bought a Mazda pickup truck. I planted a tomato garden, and she came over to berate me, because while I was gone for a long weekend, some overripe tomatoes fell to the ground and were wasted, and she informed me that from now on, she would inspect my garden daily to ensure there was no waste. Thinking about it for a while, it became obvious that this couple grew up during the Depression, and her husband was a disabled World War II veteran. She hated the Japanese, and she despised any sort of perceived waste of food. I told her she could take as many tomatoes as they needed, and after that she pretty much left me alone. Story 9, when she lectured me about being on phentermine prescribed by my doctor after nearly 6 months of extreme dieting and 14 hours a week of exercise and not losing weight, and suggested I do insert fad crash diet here. She's grossly overweight, and this was at a neighborhood gathering where we were eating chicken and waffles. I was eating some fried tenders. She was eating both chicken and waffles smothered in butter and syrup. I shrugged and ignored her. A while later, after a boxing fight camp where I had cut myself off from sodas to help my weight loss, she saw me standing in the street talking to the neighbors. We actually like sipping on my first soda in 16 weeks. She screams from her driveway, "Are you drinking a soda?" I ignored her again. The next morning, as I'm getting into my car to drive to work, I see her driving her son to school, eating out a family-sized bag of Lay's potato chips. The last straw happened about 3 months ago, and I finally wrote her and her rotten family off for good. I was unloading boxes from my car, and she asked if I'd lost my job. I told her no, they were baby clothes we received for friends of ours. She looked at me and said, "Okay, why do you have baby clothes?" I proceeded to tell her that we were in the process of becoming foster parents. She tells me that she had a friend of a friend who had an awful experience adopting through foster care, and her little girl just a monster, that we should be careful, and that it probably isn't right for us. I just walked away, and we haven't spoken since then. Story 10, what a timely post. A new person moved into the apartment next to me last weekend and has been making nonstop noise ever since. which is understandable having just moved, but it goes on almost 247. I'm a bad sleeper and awake frequently at 2, 3, 4 a.m., and there is loud banging and crashing every night. Well, last night at 2:50 a.m., he went out on his balcony and just shouted nonsense and said mother about 50 times, so I suspect he is not right in the head. Time will tell. This isn't super extreme, but we had neighbors who would let their dog out off the leash and then be shocked when he didn't come back. Would hear them screaming Silas all the time. I guess they were a little weird and definitely stupid. Story 11, my neighbor is a prostitute. She dressing like a prostitute and receiving multiple men a day at her apartment tipped me off. This is pretty much beyond reasonable doubt. If you saw her, you'd know what I mean. She's a nice lady, though. Story 12, buddy was tipped off by having the tip of a but hit his mouth. Friend of mine told me this story. He moved into a basement apartment. Like a normal, decent person, went upstairs to introduce himself to the neighbor. When he opened the door after saying hello and all that good stuff, neighbor offered my buddy a sip of Pepsi. He was holding a 2-liter bottle. Kind of nice, kind of odd, but whatever. My buddy was actually thirsty, so he accepted and took a sip, but something hit his lip, and he made a face. And the neighbor goes, "Oh, did you get a butt?" He went on to explain how he liked to drink Pepsi with cigarette butts in them, something about the flavor or some. All while my friend is just standing there with a horrified look on his face, like, WTF is that? You think someone else would enjoy that and just offer it to them? Story 13 summoned us over to the fence to pet a baby raccoon he had just found, then made us promise not to tell our parents. Later they assured us that the raccoon was tame. They knew this for certain. See, because they slept with it every night. Constructed a cage taller than their actual house with plans to fill it with feral cats, no dividers or separate cells, just a giant wire box before the city made them take it down. Not only was it 4 kinds of illegal, but of all the places, they built it right up against the line of our property where we kids would play on our playground. Blamed the failure of their cat palace on us. Put a letter in the mailbox of everyone in our neighborhood warning them to keep their pets indoors because my parents were catching and killing people's cats. Beat his wife with a vacuum cleaner, got into a fist fight with the cops, jumped into his car, and tore off in the shortest car chase ever as the cops shot out his tires before he got a few meters down the street. Oh boy, I could go on. These guys were a train wreck. Story 14, it's our superintendent, and when I caught him peering into my bathroom window while I was cleaning the tub was basically the deciding factor. Also, my dog doesn't like him. Story 15, I like to sit in my car in my driveway for a while after I get home, and I noticed that cars would pull up to my neighbor's house, and he would walk out, and they would exchange things through the window, then the car would drive off. I assumed they were selling drugs. I also noticed that all the guys that come over were all bald and tatted, so I made the assumption that they were white supremacists. A few weeks ago, the DEA came and busted them for drugs, and it turns out they're part of a prolific white supremacist group after all. Story 16, it was a 2-floor setup. My apartment was above hers. We had a shed that we both agreed would be a good place to store our bikes. One day, I go out to the shed and I get my bike, and I see the tires are low in air. So I grab my bike pump out of the shed. While putting air in my tires, my neighbor comes out and goes, there's a gas station down the street with an air pump. It only costs 75 cents. You should check it out. And thinking, okay, thanks, but I played it off like maybe she thought it wasn't very HOA friendly to see someone pumping their bike tires in front of the condo. Who knows? So I put it back, and that's when I realized she has her own tire pump in there. She thought I was using her tire pump. Whatever, no big deal, right, wrong? She went to all of the neighbors and would tell them to look out for me, because if I'm brazen enough to use someone else's tire pump, I'm obviously capable of all sorts of evil. She accused me of taking her mail. She accused me of breaking the door to the shed. Then it became me driving home drunk every night and causing a racket in the process. This was a new town, and I didn't even know anyone, and I worked. How could I be drinking every night? She accused me of stomping around the apartment during the times that I was at work. I burned something in the kitchen one time. There was no fire. It wasn't a big deal. So I opened my windows. She reported me to the POA because apparently it had been an ongoing issue and she was afraid I would set the building on fire. I never really cooked in that apartment because I had briquettes on the way to work. I had lunch at work, and most nights my dinner was takeout or fruit or yogurt. But she's sitting here complaining about how she's petrified for her life because I burned something in the oven once. Then she started in with the overnight guest issue. My father came to pick me up one time because my car was being worked on and couldn't get anywhere myself. Well, my dad is a young-looking guy. I hate to admit that people have confused my father for being my boyfriend on many occasions, and it didn't help that he picked me up in his Corvette. So this woman spun the story into she's bringing home strange men every night, men in sports cars. One day, she was bitching to me about how she's sick of these men coming to pick me up and revving their engines outside of their window. I told her no, that is my father, and he wasn't doing anything. Oh, sure he is, then gives me this look like she's calling me a with her eyes. All because she thought I used her tire pump. That was the catalyst. We had literally zero issues before the grave misunderstanding that was me putting air in my bike tires. I mean, it's a tire pump. It's not like I'm using up all the oxygen. It's air for S sake. I have confronted her a couple of times about things and tried being nice to her, but she would give me some condescending answer like, shouldn't you be in school instead of stomping around up there? I was a 30-year-old working adult who only came home at night to sleep. Story 17. I had a neighbor that would inject drugs into her while she was pregnant. It made her skin look half rotten. It was covered with these strange black bumps. She liked showing her cleavage, so it wasn't hard to find out. Story 18. I'm not sure if this constitutes weird Krasnot right, but he had this big lifted truck, and for no reason he would just rev the engine every day. He would sit in his truck and just rev the engine. One night he got into a fight with his girlfriend, and he screamed at her and got in the truck, got in it, and just rev the engine. Story 19. When I found out he murdered his wife, stabbed her 13 times apparently, did his time, then was my neighbor, really quite guy, friendly, but it's something you hear and don't forget about. Story 20. I've yet to meet them, and they seem nice enough, except for the fact that my next-door neighbors in my new apartment leave their door open almost all of the time, and their pad is full of grotesque, macabre dolls hanging by their necks all around the apartment. Story 21. In a previous apartment, my roommates and I, for some reason, were the only females living in our apartment building. I always knew all the guys in our apartment hung out together. They terrified me. They were all big, many, obviously worked out and/or played sports. They sometimes called at us or stared at us, which made us very uncomfortable. We avoided coming and going as much as possible. We had requested to move buildings, but the management was incompetent, so we were stuck. One night I was in the apartment alone, and I heard commotion outside the front door. I snuck up and looked out the peephole, and nearly every single guy who lived in our building was standing outside, looking suspicious, whispering, smoking, etc. Didn't look like any of them had weapons, but I wasn't sure. One of them knocked on the door, and they all got quiet, and I freaked. I'm only 5 feet 3 inches tall, tiny, and not at all strong, so I grabbed a butcher knife and ran into the laundry room since the door was next to impossible to open once closed. I shut the door and dialed the cops. Turns out these guys never tried to break in or anything, and were gone by the time the cops arrived or ran off upon seeing them. The cops were nice, though. They still collected a statement from me, and one actually followed me in his police car to my boyfriend's apartment in a nearby complex, so they would know I was safe for the night. Well, that's when I knew my neighbors were crazy, and I got the out of there as soon as my lease was up. I also purchased a pistol and moved into a gun-friendly complex since I go to school in this town, and it has a pretty high crime rate. Edit for clarification. Some people have said it seemed like I overreacted to this situation, which it looks like based on my wording, and I forgot to add some details. Before this happened, I had caught these guys doing drugs. One beat a girl up in the parking lot, one kidnapped his girlfriend and went to jail, etc., etc. So I was not about to open the door. That's why I called the cops. Story 22. Mild, but mows his lawn constantly, like he's out every day with his lawnmower trimming the grass, and gives me dirty looks when I let mine get too long compared to his. I haven't decided if he hates his family or just loves lawn maintenance. Story 23. A combo of two things. One, hearing the mom and daughter get into full-on yelling matches with each other that could be heard inside of my own house, with their and our windows closed. Two, their collection of old lawnmowers in the backyard that I never saw them use or even touch. Extra credit, a friend of my dad went over to their house once to ask them about possibly using one of the lawnmowers. He looked in the window and saw a classic case of hoarding. He then had the massive to walk into the house. He said it was exactly like what you see on TV, massive stacks of random little pathways from one room to another. Their dog had made a nest somewhere in the house. The fridge was apparently a disaster, with old, rotten, moldy food crammed into every shelf. It was a crazy breach of privacy, but interesting to hear the results when he came back. Story 24. Finally, and a AskReddit question I can share this on. He wasn't weird Krasnot, right, like this post suggests, but he was a neighbor to remember. Okay, so this isn't my current neighbor since I moved, but he was my neighbor between the ages of about 5 to 13. He was a skinny, older man who looked surprisingly healthy despite the unavoidable aging ID say he was 80, but a very good-looking 80. He also had a wife, which I was told, but she was in bed sick. He'll go into details later. Anyways, we, meaning me and my family, didn't pay him any mind, and he returned the favor. There was no reason for us to even be concerned about him, until one day, close to Christmas, when he came knocking on our door. My mom answered, seeing it was him, and he asked us if we wanted to come in to see his Christmas tree. He was an old man, so my mom gave us the go-ahead, and we all walked outside with him and into his house. We got in, and all the lights were turned off with only a few candles lit. Making our way through the house was hard since we were just outside where it was bright, or at least I, tread carefully. My mom almost knocked over a lamp. On our way to his living room, the front door opens up to the kitchen. We pass by a room, which is the only well-lit room in the house, where his wife was. The lights were on. She was laying on her back with her head propped up and was looking asleep. When I walked past, her eyes opened up. She saw me and smiled. I waved and continued walking. Well, we reached the last room, the living room, and turned the corner, and there's the tree. It was about 5 feet tall, but was taller than me at the time since I was 6, and was decorated with blue lights that were emphasized by the surrounding darkness, and no more than 15 ornaments, with one at the midsection containing a framed picture of an adult man, I'd say 20-something, and a beautiful girl, who I would say is also around that age range. I was going to ask who they were, but even then I knew it was him and his wife when they were younger. Thinking it would make good conversation, I asked knowing the answer. He inhaled quickly, the way you do before you sneeze, and let out a long sigh. "That's my brother and Meredith, his wife," he answered. This surprised me, of course, since I already had a "when was this taken?" last week comment ready to go, but hearing it was neither him nor his wife, I didn't know what to ask. Fortunately, I didn't need to, since he continued talking. "This was taken 1958, that there's my brother, Paul, and his wife, Meredith. They were married for a good 45 years before." He paused and looked down with a sad look on his face. I wanted to ask before what, but even at that age, I knew better. And like before, he continued before I could say anything. Before he got sick, he left it at that. And I decided it was best I did too, although I really wanted to know more. My mom gave him a hug, thanked him for inviting us. Then we went back home. On our way out, I passed by the door again and saw her there. Her eyes were closed. I assumed she was asleep. And that was that. Christmas came, got a bunch of cool stuff, and had a blast. Come New Year's, same thing minus the presents. It wasn't until mid-January that I saw him again. I was playing in the backyard, kicking the soccer ball with my older brother and the cur dog we had, having fun, when he decided to walk inside literally right when I kick it to him. Didn't even announce he was leaving. Like with the man anyways, he walks in, and I'm out there with the dog, kicking the ball. She chases after it. Fun, right? Well, a few moments pass, and I see her neighbor walk out back. He sees me, smiles, and looks down, bearing that same sad look he had when he told me about his brother. He sits down in a chair and just rests there. I didn't want to bother him, so I put the dog up and go inside. When I walk inside, I see my brother with his soda about to go back out. He says he was just getting a drink, but I said we should stay in. So we stay in and play video games and the like. The next day, I was outside in the backyard again, this time alone with the dog, and he walks outside again, and again sees me, smiles, and looks down, except this time he didn't look sad. He just looked empty. I walked up to the fence and asked him what's wrong since I was a sweet little kid back then. He laughs and says, "Nothing. Just a rough 2 days," he says, bearing a smile that was forced past a large amount of sadness. I ask how come, and he thinks for a moment and just says, "They'll let you know later." I leave it at this, say goodbye, and go inside. I decide to leave the dog out of her pen since she just got out. I go to my room, which has a window overlooking the part of the backyard I was just at, and I see my dog hopping up on the fence where the neighbor is. I was going to tap on the window, which is her cue to get down, but the old man reached down and was petting her, smiling. That happened for about a week after that. I let the dog out, play with her, and whoever else was out at the time. And sometime later, a neighbor would come out and pet her. One day after school, out back with the dog, the neighbor comes out and waves me over. Remember how I said I'd tell you later? He asked, "Yeah, about why you were so sad?" I said back. He smiled and said, "Yep. Well, that old lady in the house, you saw her, right? That one time," I think for a second before saying, "Well, not old, but I did see a lady in bed. I was taught to make comments that make old people feel young." He laughed and continued, "No, she was old. Well, a week ago, she passed away." Hearing this, I didn't know what to say. I never lost a loved one and didn't know how to respond to someone telling me this. So little old me just says, "That's not good." He just nods and stands there leaning against the fence. "Well, thanks for telling me," I say. "No problem. See you later," he says, walking back inside. I do the same. He ended up coming by our house 2 days later. "Hey, would you mind coming to Meredith's funeral?" He asked my mom. So apparently that old lady wasn't his wife, but was his brother's wife. My mom agrees to go. So we go at the funeral. Once the old lady is buried, we all go up to the old man. Typical sorry for your loss and hugs and whatnot, but I needed answers, damn it. So I go up and ask him, "Was that your brother's wife?" He says yes, and tells me he's been taking care of her for the past 5 years since she was bedridden, and her husband, his brother, died. I asked him what happened to his wife, and he said that she passed away long ago. After this, we frequently invited him to our house for cookouts, holidays, and just for the sake of it, half of every visit was spent with him in the backyard with our dog. At about 13, we were moving away, and since we couldn't take our dog with us, we decided to leave her with him. We tell him this a week before we move, and just decide to let him take care of the dog so we can at least see how he is with her. And she is with him. They get along smoothly. He feeds her leftovers. They're happy together, and all is good. Well, unfortunately, 5 days after we gave him our dog, 2 days before we left, he had a heart attack and died. So we ended up giving our dog to our uncle who already has another, and that was that. TLDR old man takes care of brother's sick wife. Gets to know us, we go to her funeral, give him our dog, and he dies of a heart attack. Story 25, we knew they were bad. No dad. Mother didn't have clue, and 2 teens, boy and girl, running wild. We only had a couple months left on our lease, so we stayed. Then one day the cops show up. 8 cars, a van, and one of those command trucks. They went in and out of the house from about 9 a.m. till dark. It was on the news. Mom and kids arrested. Weed and crack found. The worst was the guns. These kids had nearly 200 guns, rifles, and pistols, all stolen. Some had been used in crimes. Their landlord emptied the house the next day, and we never saw them again. Story 26, probably when he came over drunk and introduced himself to me and my mom. We were on our porch smoking a cigarette, and my at the time 3-year-old was running around the porch playing. He came up, and we got a small talking, and asked what there was to do for fun here since we just moved here. His response, creepy chuckle, while I masturbate a lot and smear on my walls. Story 27, 5-year-old me was running around the apartment having fun like 5-year-olds do when we got a call on the house phone, and I picked up to hear my downstairs neighbor telling me he's going to break my legs. Story 28, at the time, I was 20 and had just moved into an apartment complex on the 2nd story floor. The neighbor in question was somewhere in his 40s, living alone on the 1st floor. This was also about 2 years ago, but I still remember that after being there for only the first 2 days, my downstairs neighbor was starting to make plans with me, involving him, his 12-year-old daughter, whom he had partial custody of on the weekends, and myself, suggesting things like we could all go to the zoo, movies, dinner outings, and immediately started talking to me about having me to his place and following me into mine because, in his words, it was the gentlemanly thing to do and to make sure I was safe, despite the fact we lived a few feet apart. He quickly confessed to feeling an infatuation tension with me. I started feeling as though he was just trying to find a replacement mom for his kid and start a relationship with me out of severe neediness, especially due to hearing he had gone through a terrible divorce, which is what led him to live in the apartment complex to begin with. Needless to say, I confronted the landlord about everything that was going on, and all she said was to ignore him. After stating that was just who he was, so I avoided him at all costs for the remainder of my stay, but eventually left due to financial issues, despite him offering to help pay. TLDR neighbor in his 40s wanted a relationship with 20-year-old me, and that he already pictured a life together after only knowing me for 2 days. Story 29-1, he keeps a telescope mounted on a tripod aimed at our bedroom window from his bedroom window. There's a night light near the telescope, so we can see movement, but it's hard to tell what he's really up to. 2, he has 7 sets of wind chimes hanging on the porch, all tuned in different keys. Thus, they create an annoying cacophonic din on windy nights. Story 30, when she screamed at our dogs over our shared back fence, screamed, "You stop that barking right now." It was Sunday afternoon, a holiday weekend, and my in-laws were in town, and we were sitting outside on our deck just drinking a glass of wine and relaxing. Our 2 dogs were playing tug-of-war with a rope, and the younger one started barking. He had been barking for maybe 30 seconds, a minute. She started screaming over the fence, so, of course, the dog got very excited and started running around like a maniac until we could get him inside. I honestly don't think she realized we were in the yard with the dogs, so then my husband went over to the fence to apologize, and she went on a rant about how the dogs are always out here barking false. They live inside, and we bring them in if they start barking at all when we are home, and they're outside since these people, my husband and I, who had bought our home almost a year prior, and whom she had met before moved in. Then she threatened to sue us. Later we went to apologize to our other neighbors about our dogs barking, since we figured maybe they barked a lot more than we realized when we weren't home, and maybe despite them being inside the house, it was bothering people. Every other neighbor said they never noticed it. One of our neighbors then let us know they were afraid of this lady because she's been known to file complaints with the city on pretty much anyone who annoyed her, going as far to drive one woman out of the neighborhood altogether. Batty old woman. I can't stand her. Haven't seen or heard anything from her at all in the year since this incident happened. Story 31, when I was younger, my neighbor had supposedly set up a tent in his house and wanted me to come over and play. I was like 8 years old at the time. Just WTF. Story 32, me in my friend's house, 4 o'clock in the morning. Me and a friend sitting playing Rocket League. Bang, bomb. A random, huge Russian man with a huge, drunk German shepherd at the door. Call cops and spend an hour trying to tell him that it isn't us that are being loud. If the other names across the street, the other names are outside screaming at each other at least twice a week. He was drunk and couldn't understand us. After an hour, he finally went home. We returned to Rocket League, and the police arrived at 555. Took 2 hours for the head police to get here. The station is 30 seconds away. Story 33. I was living in a small apartment complex with only 6 units, 3 on top, 3 on bottom. My upstairs neighbor slowly went crazy over the course of a few weeks, probably due to drugs. Had always been a stoner, but I guess he had started experimenting, and it really screwed him up. The first sign was when my boyfriend and I were coming home late one night, and the neighbor, we'll call him Jake, was outside looking worried. When we asked him what was up, he said he heard screaming and crying coming from the unit next to us. There were 2 kids and their parents who lived there, but all the lights were out, and it was obvious everyone was asleep. We thought maybe the parents had been fighting earlier, and Jake was being paranoid, so we said goodnight and told him not to worry. It only escalated from there. He became obsessed with his family. His drug-scorched mind convinced him that the mom was abusing the children, and he even accused her of molesting them. This being a small complex, everybody knew everybody and helped care for each other's kids, so they all knew this was total. The mother was understandably furious and hurt by his accusations, as they had been close when he was sober. She didn't blame him, though. She kept trying to tell him to stop with the drugs and that they were screwing him up. His fixation on this family drove him to do some weird things. He drew weird chalk circles around their front door and even tried to barricade them inside with some porch furniture. I saw him multiple times hiding behind the railing upstairs for no apparent reason and heard all kinds of crashing and muttering at all hours of the night. When Jake started trying to talk to the kids about his weird accusations, his whole face painted red. For whatever reason, the mom snapped. She yelled at him to stay away from her children and to get help. And he yelled back that she was an evil woman hurting her family. She ultimately decided to call the police, but cried the entire time they questioned her. She was crying as she had lost both a friend and a neighbor to whatever awful substances he had put in his body. I'm not sure what happened to Jake. Story 34. When I figured out he throws imaginary parties. He sets up chairs and starts a fire in his pit and blasts his radio. It took a little while to realize he wasn't on a Bluetooth and was actually talking to his imaginary guests. Story 35. When she put notes under my car windshield every day for a week, with each note containing a complaint like "Don't slam your garbage can lid before 10 a.m. to I saw your tree, has lemons gonna waste, so they'll take a bag to when parking on the street. Don't leave so much space." Or maybe the time she called me at midnight to complain that her doctor wouldn't prescribe stronger Ativan. Story 36. Locked their 5-year-old out of their apartment on accident. I gave him a swift talking to. About 2 weeks later, one lady living there decided to set the apartment on fire. Luckily, no one was harmed. They turned out to be heroin addicts, for sure the worst neighbors ill probably ever have. Story 37. Might have been the time he barricaded himself in his house and had a standoff with the police. Or maybe when the half-built house on his property, which was unfinished because he ran out of money, caught fire and rapidly burnt to the ground despite being vacant, with no electricity wired to it, in February, with 6 of snow on the ground. Or maybe when he killed himself with a shotgun in his house. Grew up next to the guy, and he was always kind and friendly, but dude had some serious issues and a lot of real bad breaks. Story 38. When we moved in next to them in North Carolina mid-90s, the wife of an older couple came over and asked us if we want to ride to church that Sunday. My parents had already scoped it out and found the local Catholic church. So my mom tells this to the woman, who then says to mom, "Oh, honey, you don't want those 2 little boys going to you. We'll pray for you." The husband would go out in the yard at 5:30 in the morning, hack up disgusting phlegm, and let out their little dog, Raleigh. "Do your business, Raleigh." Intense coughing. "Good dog, good times."